Yeah, I've got the questions. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's hard to believe that the science of nutrition that we're all here to address is little more than 100 years old. In fact, it was the discovery of vitamins in 1912 that set us apart on a journey of nutritional research and nutritional discovery. In fact, today, one of the most profound holy grails in nutrition is to quantitate from a nutrient intake perspective what we humans eat. This may sound a very simple question, but if you reflect, it's one of the most imponderable questions to determine what exactly we eat in a free-living population. If that's hard for humans who are adults, it becomes even more harder if we are trying to understand what children eat. When we look at this topic, the understanding of the nutrient intake of children has a relatively shorter span of research, and I would argue around about 10 to 15 years. And in fact, in this arena, some of the major research that you will see reported today comes from the now famous FITS and KNH program that you're very much familiar with. So when we talk about what children eat, I want to reflect for a moment and ask a more rhetorical question. Why do we need to know what children eat? And I think it's an obviously responsive annotation that we need to know what children eat in order to establish and optimize their diet for their growth, development, and well-being. Now, as we are surrounded in Asia, we have a more complex situation here where we have the double burden of both undernutrition and overnutrition. And in fact, that's also true in many parts of Latin America and Africa. And I think we live in really a world of paradoxes, and I want to remind ourselves that this is where we are in terms of over and undernutrition. And as a starting point, I want to share with you the infant mortality rates of different parts of the world, and to be amazed to find such a huge difference in infant mortality between 2 to 3 in many parts of Europe and indeed Singapore. And you then have huge responses in terms of infant mortality in Sudan and in Somalia. Almost a 7 to 6-fold difference in terms of IMR in some of these countries. And the question we need to ask is, what are we going to do? So here you see the global tapestry of undernutrition, and you can see that very large parts of Asia and parts of Africa, children are up to 25 to 30% undernourished and malnourished. We can then drill a bit further and look at the prevalence of stunting, and you see that stunting is a huge global challenge in this part of the world, and in fact, 1 in 4 children under the age of 5 are undernourished and particularly stunted. And you might ask, why are we interested in stunting? Because it turns out that stunting is a good biomarker of chronic undernutrition, and we now know that undernourished adults then give birth to low birth weight. And the important point about stunting particularly is that if you reach your height stunted at puberty, you can never recompensate that stunted stature after you reach puberty, and that's a very important point. And here we see wasting. Wasting is a simple way of looking at what's your weight for height, and again you can see the prevalence of wasting is quite high. So I think I made the convincing argument, I hope, that the severity and the magnitude of malnutrition is quite large in many, many parts of the world, and I think this is something that I'm going to develop in my presentation. about 2 decades ago, a very eminent Indian clinician called Ramalinga Swami made a very important statement. He said, why is it that in Asia we have what is called the Asian paradox, where large swathes of people are undernourished, both in terms of their magnitude and their discipline. And you can see that Asia has one of the largest prevalence of stunting, and it's also the same in terms of wasting. So that's to provide some context to what I'm going to say. And as I mentioned a moment ago, I'm going to focus on what is it in our diets, particularly in children in this region, that makes them such levels of undernutrition and wasting and stunting. So let's go back to the beginning and look at human growth. And many of you are familiar with this slide, but just to remind ourselves that this is the growth velocity of children. And you can see that in the first year of life, children gain about 7.5 to 8 kilograms per year. And then we have actually a very small rate of human growth, followed by a pubertal spurt, first in girls, a little bit earlier than boys. The point to remember, at no time in human growth will you have such a large increase in weight gain than you see in the first year of life. And even in the first year of life, you gain around about 7.5 kilograms. So you're born 3.5, and the age of 1, you're about 7.5. And so in 365 days, divide that by 7.5, even when you're growing so rapidly, you are gaining no more than 20 odd grams per day, the size of a well-grown rat. That's all we grow, incredibly small. We then come to the age between 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10. You're growing only at 2 kilograms per year, divided by 365, it's about 6 grams per day, the size of a modest mouse. So the point I'm making is that human growth is incredibly small, and only in the period of the first year of life and puberty is when we have the growth spurt. In our particular interest today, we are focusing on the childhood period, and I want you to remind yourself that the growth velocity is quite unique in all of the animal kingdom. We are one of the slowest growers, but the upside of that is that we have a chance to build up our intellectual discourse in a way that no other animal has been able to achieve. You then look at the height increment, the same velocity criteria. You can say that in the first 2 years of life is the maximum velocity of height, similar to what we have seen in the case of weight gain. So what I've done is to say to myself, okay, given that this is the maximum rate of growth in the first year of life, can we tease out on a monthly basis how our children grow? And that's what you get here. So these are centile curves for weight gain in the first 12 months of life, which is the first year of life. And you can see something interesting, that even in the first month of life, you are gaining about 800 grams, and then it comes down gradually to about 500 grams, so that by the age of 1 year, you are put on 10 kilograms. So the important point again is that only in the first 3 or 4 months of birth, from birth, you have a maximum rate of weight gain, which is a much more granularity, but then it comes down to a much more modest rate of growth. The same with height velocity. So the take-home message I'm pointing out is that both height and weight gains are maximum in the human species in the first year of life, and it tapers off until you hit puberty, which at the current time is not a foci of interest and intervention. So all of us have 4 components of energy expenditure: basal metabolic rate, physical activity, diet-induced thermogenesis, and growth. And you will see immediately, counterintuitively, that the biggest energy component is basal metabolic rate, and the smallest is growth, even in children. And I'll develop that argument in a minute. So the presumption that a large component of our energy intake goes towards growth actually is not true. And this is the largest component, which happens every minute of the day, every time of the year, and every day of the moment. So let's look at some very quick definitions. Basal metabolic rate is the measurement of energy expenditure when you're at rest. It happens all of the time. You can then see here diet-induced thermogenesis is the increase in heat production when you eat any food. And of course, you know what physical activity is, the energy expended for doing both leisure and non-leisure activities. And of course, the growth component is quite small. So then you might ask yourself, where is our energy being dissipated? And you can see here something quite fascinating, that in the newborn child, who weighs about 3.5 kilos, the child's brain weight is 475 grams, about 14% of the body weight, and the brain is expending 140 kilocalories per day, which is almost 70% of the child's basal metabolic rate. So basically, the baby is burning his head off, metaphorically, of course. And I think this is quite interesting in that even when you come down to 5 years of age, the brain metabolism is about 40%, and at 10 years it's down to 34%, and for you and me, we are still burning 1/4 of our energy from the use of the brain activity. So this is quite an important observation in that the brain development and brain utilization contributes to a large amount of the energy expenditure that we encounter both during childhood and during adulthood. So some years ago, my professor at the London School of Hygiene, John Watlow, and his colleague Philip Payne did a simple calculation asking the question, we can work out the growth in terms of grams per day, and just to put on your mind, for every gram of tissue that you accrete, you only need 5 kilocalories to put 1 gram of tissue accretion. So if you remember, I talked about 20 to 25 grams per day in the first year of life. That into 5 will be about 125 calories. So the point is that if you do the calculation, the growth component of your total energy requirements is about 23% only in the first 3 months of life, and it tapers down to a very minuscule amount by the time you reach 1 to 2 years old. And the reason why I'm harping upon this is that it's only recently we have found out that there's a hierarchy in which our energy is partitioned between the energy requirements for growth, maintenance, physical activity, and for diet-induced thermogenesis. So Nancy Butte recently did a more stylized observation, and you can see that she looked at the basal metabolic rate, which we have always said is the largest component of energy expenditure right through the ages. This is your physical activity, and you can see a very small sliver of energy required for the growth component. So you have seen this slide before, and many of you know that a successful breastfeeding during the first 6 months of life has been shown to have an impressive rate of tissue growth and tissue development. So the point I'm making is that let's assume that the mother is fully breastfeeding for the first 3 to 6 months, and you can see well-endowed growth in terms of what you see in the centile curves. So the question we can ask is that if breast milk exclusively fed to a child is capable of providing optimal growth, can I look at the nutrient composition of breast milk to give me some understanding of the protein to energy requirements of breast milk? Okay, so that's what we have done here. So I've taken from the literature breast milk composition, and many of you who are working in this trade will know that breast milk has one of the lowest protein content of all animal kingdom in the world, surprisingly. And of course, the fat content is also about 3.5, and the energy content is about 70. So what I've done is to ask the question, if I take the protein content of breast milk and the calorie content of breast milk, can I do a simple calculation that gives me what is the protein energy requirements of breast milk, which is capable and allows us to have maximum growth during the first 6 months of life? So that's what I've done. I've taken the protein content and the energy content, and I've converted the protein content to calorie content, so that's 1.2 times 4, which is the calorie equivalence of 1 gram of protein, so you get 4.8 calories. And so the protein energy content will be 4.8 calories divided by 70, which comes out to 7% of energy from protein. And this is a very, very important observation, because for many, many years, people have been under the illusion that human beings require a large amount of protein for tissue accretion, and there have been many, many programs promulgating the idea that protein requirements are the one that is restrictive in human growth. And I want to argue, ladies and gentlemen, from the data that we have, at the time of maximum human growth, not even minimum, you only need 7% of your calories to come from protein. And I think that's a very interesting observation which we shall develop and move forward in my presentation. So some years ago, Alan Jackson and David Milward asked the question, if 7% of your calories is all you need to get from the protein for human growth, if I look at the cereals and staples that are consumed in around the world, so you can look at the protein content and the calorie content of any cereal or legume, and we can work out, as I did in the milk story, what is the protein energy to calorie content. So let's assume that you have 10% or 11% protein from wheat, so that's about 44 calories divided by 350 is the calorie content of 100 grams of wheat, so that you get a value of about 10%. So it turns out that many cereals actually, so that's the value of your breast milk, which I talked about, which is about 7%, so this will be 0.7%. You notice that many cereals that we consume around the world, barring cassava is widely consumed in Africa, if you eat sufficient amount of the carbohydrate containing cereal, you will meet the protein requirements, is the point I'm trying to make. So therefore, the rate limiting step is what and how can a child consume adequate energy, therefore to be able to meet your protein requirements. So this is quickly to canter through the different types of foods given to children. So that's from India, chapati, rice, and various types of gruels. And you can also see some communities eating things like banana. So much of the take-home message is that we, as a group of people around the world, at least in Asia, are eating diets that are high in carbohydrate, high in glycemic index value, low in micronutrients, low in fat, and low in energy density. So this, given that we're going to be hearing quite a lot from the presenters on the Feeds and Kids program, I've taken at random another study that's looked at the children's food intake called the CNUT study. And I just want to reinforce to you, this is from Indonesia. I hope the Indonesian colleagues here are able to see and comment on that study, is to see the amazing number of both rural and urban children that are unable to meet their protein and energy requirements, and of course many micronutrients. So what we are seeing is that in many parts of Asia, the dietary component right now is simply unable to meet the energy requirements, and the question has to be asked, why is that so? So there are 4 questions I would like to reflect with you together. How can we improve the energy intake of children's food that are categorized by low in energy density, high in viscosity, and poor palatability? Can we explore the use of lipids, nuts, lentils, and legumes that are rich in both fat and protein to add as a complementary contender to these kind of diets? Can we also identify and exploit many underexplored foods rich in many micronutrients, notably trace elements and vitamins that are surrounding our arena? And also, can we develop a village, community, or commercial setting to improve the quality of children's food? And I think this is something that I want to develop and say that we cannot ignore what technology can bring to what is, I think, one of the biggest challenges facing us in terms of feeding children optimally. So let's now examine in more detail an example of a complementary food that's based in Asia, focusing on rice. And this can be true if you're eating maize gruel or cassava gruel or millets and lentils. And the important point to remember is that when you cook a cereal, it has to be cooked with water, and water is the one that gelatinizes the starch to make it palatable. But water also does something quite critical, which is it reduces the energy density of the food and also becomes sticky. So now I'm going to take you to a rural village in any part of Asia or Africa it could be, and look at a mother who's trying to develop a weaning food based on rice, and she's got several children to look after. She's got to feed her child who's on the breast, make complementary food for the other siblings, also go to the field to work, also prepare food for the family. What is the conundrum that she has? And I want to share with you something quite fascinating. So we have taken some powdered rice and made it with 1.5 times water, increased to 2 times water, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and 6 times. And even with adding 6 times of water in your rice, the viscosity of the rice is so hard and peppy that the mother cannot feed the child. The child has a gag reflex because the viscosity is so different to what it's accompanied. So what does the mother do? Before that, we have another conundrum. So this is the same slide I showed you a moment ago. At 91 degrees, when it is hot, the viscosity is quite fluid and it can be fed. But how on earth are we going to feed a child at 91 degrees? It will burn his mouth. So we have to cool it down. And as soon as you cool a rice that is 6 times the water content, it becomes thick and impossible. So the mother has to decide, how am I going to alternate this viscosity dilemma with the energy density dilemma? And here you see here again, what we have done here is to notice that we have made the gruel with 10 times water at 30 degrees, and even then it's not viscous enough for the mother to feed the child. At 15 times, now it is capable of being fed to the child. But you have a problem. And what's the problem? Every time you dilute the rice with water, the energy density is dramatically declining down to 50 calories per 100 grams, which means if you feed 1 gram of rice gruel, it gets 0.5 calories. Incredibly small amount in terms of the dietary needs of the child. So I put all this together in a simple graphics. So you have on the x-axis the amount of water content, on the y-axis here energy density, and here the status of viscosity from solid to liquid. So let me walk you through here. So if you have no water added, so the gruel will be 350 calories, but of course the more water you add, the energy density declines, but of course the energy density decline is concomitantly articulated with a decrease in viscosity. So the real problem that we have is to find a food that is viscous enough for the child to be fed, inevitably has a lower energy density. And that's a conundrum in terms of those two mismatches. So what I've then done is to ask the question, on average, a 1-year-old child requires about 900 to 1,000 calories per day. And let's assume that what is the relationship between the energy density of the food in terms of the amount of food that you need to require. So let's assume for the sake of argument that you have 1 tub of butter that's got 9 calories per gram. So if I fed my baby completely butter, which is 9 calories per gram, the child has to only eat 100 grams of butter, which is of course theoretical, to meet the 1,000 calories that it requires. But the real challenge is that most of the food that we consume is in this range of 0.25 to 0.75 calories per cooked cereal. And at that amount of energy density, the child has to eat something like 1,500 to 2,000 grams per day. Absolutely impossible. Even an elephant can't eat that. I mean, of course, physically. It can, but you know what I mean. So the real problem that we have is that the energy density precludes the child from getting sufficient calories to meet both the energy needs and the protein needs of the growing child. So I further developed this theme by asking the question, over the age of 1 to 6, I've given the calorie requirements at every single age, and you can see now how impossibly hard any child between 1 to 6 can eat energy dense foods that are so low, it's got to eat 2 kilograms. Even I can't eat 2 kilograms, and neither can any of you. So there is a real problem in feeding children in many emerging countries adequate gruel or a weaning food that can meet the energy requirements. And of course, to put it into context, in many parts of Europe and North America, our weaning foods are in this region about 1.2 to 2 kilocalories per gram, and those are quite comfortable amounts, about 300 to 400 grams over 3 feeding cycles to meet. So, this I think is a critical point. If a child consumes adequate energy calories from a meal, the meal will automatically satisfy the protein requirements. So the point is that if you can appease a child's energy requirements, as we have seen before, it will automatically appease its protein requirements. And of course, the key to optimal growth is to first meet the child's calorie or energy requirements. And I think this puts us into a very interesting conundrum, because we now know for the first time there's a hierarchy of obligation to the body in terms of how it partitions the calories that you consume. So if you don't consume adequate calories and don't meet your basal metabolic rate, then your basal metabolic rate will be reduced. Your next requirements to meet your diet-induced thermogenesis, and third is physical activity and growth. So observational studies from many parts of the world have shown that if you eat a poor calorie diet, you reduce your basal metabolic rate, reduce diet-induced thermogenesis, and incredibly reduce your physical activity. And in this hierarchy, you can see the last but not least member is growth. So if you don't meet these 3 criteria, growth is kaput. So therefore, growth is really going to be the last member of the energy requirement cycle that we've talked about. So just to summarize this part, we have a huge quadratic problem, which is how do you develop a complementary food that poses 4 enormous biological challenges? How do I get adequate energy density? How do I get the right viscosity? How do I get the sufficient micronutrients that we require? And of course, palatability. And I think that's something that I want to focus on in the next few minutes. So many of you in the audience will know that for the past 15 odd years, we have a product called ready-to-eat therapeutic foods that are largely now used for treating malnourished children. But I think there's a nugget of truth in that paradigm that may be useful for our discussion this morning. And RUFT is a vitamin and mineral fortified peanut paste, just like peanut butter, by the way, mixed with dry milk powder that has been claimed, and I think it's very, very true, that it has got a very high energy density and also has got a very high palatability that has been used widely in many parts of the world to treat chronic malnutrition. And that's the composition of the RUTF. It's got full fat milk, sugar, vegetable oil, peanut butter, and that's the composition. And it just tastes actually and feels and looks like peanut butter. And if those of you want to try it, you're most welcome, even if you're not malnourished. And that's the composition. So look at this. It's got 10 times the calorie content per gram of the staples that I've talked about. So this has got 5.45 calories per 1 gram compared to the 0.5 we talked about, protein level, impressive lipids, and the carbohydrate. So the question that I want to pose to you is that can we emulate the RUTF model to bring into the wisdom of our ready-to-eat therapeutic food paradigm into developing low-cost complementary foods in regions of the world that have got huge problems of meeting their calorie requirements. So some years ago, we asked the question, why should we stop at only using peanuts? So Steve, Colin, and myself did some work on asking the question, can we take it down to the field where peanuts are not a paradigm? What about places where there is no access to peanuts, or there may be more susceptible to peanut allergy? And we developed a series of RUTF type models looking at rice flour, soya protein, sesame seed, sunflower, and the premixes. And now we are pleased to say that some of these formulations are widely used in many parts of Asia and also in Africa. That does not depend on a production that's many, many miles away, but at the local village or the community level. So we have a whole series of formulations that we developed that's not based on peanuts. So the question that we can now ask is, Second to the calorie content, we have now recently recognized, I'm sorry if you can't see this slide, this is the micronutrient cocktail that's used in the RUTF, because you'll be surprised to know that in addition to meeting the calorie requirements of the child, trace elements like potassium, like zinc, like copper, can have a profound effect on the energy cost of growth and how you grow. So you might have all the calorie content, but if you don't have certain micronutrients that are necessary for tissue accretion, you might not get much growth at all. So I'm trying to weave together what are the opportunities and challenges to try and confront this huge problem that we are facing today. And I think one promising area is something that you are very familiar, which is biofortification, which is essentially trying to use plant breeding to produce cereals and legumes and lentils that are high in micronutrients, and you can see some of the micronutrients that are being added on through plant breeding in this program. And I think this has got some promise, and we know that many cereals are deficient in all cacophony of different types of micronutrients, and this may be a very important avenue for discourse and investigation. And the second point is that I think we are being very, very restrictive in our thinking process, which is that we have a huge taxonomy of plants, 300,000 known to man, about 100,000 used by humankind for various things, not only for food but for other commercial reasons, 30,000 that are edible. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that we only use 30 plant species to meet 90% of our needs. And it becomes a more paradoxical that we only use 3 cereals, rice, wheat, and maize, in 60% of our population to meet their calorie need. So the question I want to pose to you is that, are we missing a whole gamut of plant species that may be the richest source of iodine, the richest source of calcium, the richest source of magnesium, which you simply don't know? And the question is that, how can we provide a systematic taxonomy of dividing the plant species into foods that are rich in micronutrients, rich in vitamins, in a way that we have not done systematically thus far? And so I now come back full circle to ask the question, the reason why all staples have this curious problem of increase in viscosity is because of these 2 little fellows called amylose and amylopectin, which are the 2 major strands of starch in any plant kingdom that we use as staple. When we boil any staple, the starch swells and gelatinizes, and the ratio of amylose to amylopectin is what actually articulates the energy density and the viscosity of food. So the question now becomes, can we use technology to try and manage by altering the viscosity of food and also diminish the way in which these carbohydrates swell up? And so we've just started a program in our laboratory to ask the question, can the structural engineering of foods manipulate the viscosity, the palatability, the flavor profile of food? And I think this is something we're going to see much more of happen in the future. So those of you who heard the excellent presentation yesterday will recognize that even in the kind of challenging question that we asked yesterday, these are the areas that are actually being considered. What is the way in which you chew food alters your recognition of sensory properties, your flavor, etc.? What about the way in which actually it granulates the food in terms of tribology, bolus formation, swallowing, and the residual? So the point is that, can we have a tapestry of research that looks at food engineering in a unique way that can alter the oral processing, which is what we are in this room all keen to articulate and understand? So this is from a very famous slide by a venture capitalist called Vivek Wadhwa, and he makes a very eloquent point that clearly technology is advanced exponentially, and we are all the great benefactors of DNA discovery, penicillin, automobiles, PCRs, nuclear energy, etc., genomics. But where on the exponential curve, ladies and gentlemen, is a revolution in food technology? Where is technology going to play in trying to understand some of the most pressing problems in the world in terms of feeding our people and our children in a more beneficial and a factorial way? And I want to end by saying that I think the next revolution in food technology would be in trying to understand how the structure of food can be manipulated for sensory, gustatory, taste, and energy density in a way that we have not explored and actually articulated until today. And the penultimate slide is for me to remind yourself that the enormous base of the pyramid in terms of a population, they are a huge group of people that we simply have not addressed our talent and our intellectual discourse in a way that we ought to be. And in fact, I would argue that of the 4 billion, 1 billion people live on less than $1.5 per day. What role are we going to play in terms of addressing the problem in terms of our intellectual inputs and our opportunity for social corporate responsibility? So, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I hope I have convinced you that childhood undernutrition remains a major public health challenge in many regions of the world. Several emerging nations, children's food are low in energy density, high in viscosity, and poor in palatability. Now, I want to point out the application of technology at the village, community, or commercial scale may be the only feasible way in which we can develop optimal foods for the region. And I think here, technology may be the only solution. Processing of food may be one of the only solutions to get to meet this triangulation of needs of a child. And I think our greatest challenge is to how best we can collectively resolve the problem of providing adequate diet for children worldwide. And given the complexity of feeding children appropriately, an integrative approach is necessary where nutritionists, physiologists, psychologists, clinicians, sensory scientists, and technologists will all have a key role to play. And I want by saying, ladies and gentlemen, that here in this room are some of the most brightest brains in all of these disciplines. What role can we play to combat one of the most pressing problems in our world today and beyond? And I want to end by a very, very important Nobel Prize winner who simply said, I think encapsulate what you and I want to say, many things can wait, children cannot. Today their bones are being formed, their blood is being made, their senses are being developed. To them, we cannot say tomorrow. Their name is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Henry, for such a comprehensive report. Comprehensive in the sense that you updated us on the nutrition situation worldwide, and in particular in Asian countries, and expounding on how energy distribution is utilized, and linking this with growth velocity. And with that, you also analyze the nutrient intake of the population groups and questions on how to improve on the diet. So with all of this introduction that you gave, you expounded the concept of Asian enigma, or why are the Asians more undernourished compared with the rest of the world, and offering approaches such as the RUTF, as well as the biofortification of cereals and tubers. And you ended up with challenges, and you said that technology is indeed needed for us to work on improving the Asian enigma. So the floor is now open for questions and answers. Yes, questions from the floor?
No question.
Yes, sir.
I thought it was an outstanding presentation, and I think most of the audience would agree. I didn't write any notes, I was just listening. It was fantastic. One of the things which occurs to me is that there has been enormous success in meeting the nutritional needs of the world, and indeed Asia, over centuries. So it can't be completely broken. And the question is, what parts of it are broken that cause the problem? In other words, a lot of people seem to do extremely well. I'm looking around the room here, and they're all pretty good. So is it poverty is our biggest problem? Or is it how big an issue is poverty?
Thank you, Mike. I think poverty is a huge issue, no question about it. But I think it also becomes a metaphorical dustbin in which you put every problem. Oh, it's because of poverty. And I think that's absolutely true that poverty has a major role to play. But the question that we can ask is that, are there things that one could do with either social construct or technological construct that we haven't thought through. I think it's very easy for us to be very dismissive and say, you know what, if we make everybody rich and accessible to food, we're going to have none of this problem. That's not going to happen immediately. One hopes for that. But I also think, very firmly and very convincingly that the role in which technology can play has been underplayed. In the sense that at whatever level, at the village level, community level, industrial level, it doesn't matter. But how can we bear the forces of science and technology on some of these problems that actually would require that kind of intellectual digression of thought to get to the problems that we are seeing? So to give you one example, this is a very interesting story which is from Switzerland. For many, many years, as you know, those who have come as older folks from Switzerland, endemic goiter is quite common in Switzerland. And it was wiped out by fortification. And so here's a good example of a problem that was resolved by the technical subvention of adding iodine to many foods. So that's a very simplistic example, much more accessible in terms of what you can do. But the point I'm trying to make in a very sort of paraphrased way is that we need to be careful that we don't park every problem that we see into the altar of poverty. Oh, yeah.
Other questions?
Yes, it's over there.
No, it's not actually a question, it's a comment. I've been a pediatrician now for 3.5 decades. So the question in our country, in India, was not so much of poverty now. It was 3.5 decades ago, it was poverty. Now the economic status of most people has increased tremendously. So we have a problem of a lot of misconceptions and wrong beliefs as far as the food quality and content is concerned. That is a major concern rather than the inability to access food. It is the quality of the food and this concepts that certain foods are bad for health and that certain foods cause diseases and that a child requires much less than an adult does. So it's more of a misconception rather than lack of availability. Food is available, money is available. It's misconceptions that are causing problems in this point in time.
Can't agree more. There's another question there.
You told that technology can be implemented or looked at to improve the quality of food and other things. But that takes a lot of research, lot of money, lot of time. Can we do something at a grassroots level to look at improving the nutrient content or the availability of the food, and that can be disseminated first than the technology, which takes a little longer time and needs more investment?
Yeah. So I think I may have given you the misconception that technology means high tech in terms of, I think I endorse what Ravi said. There is a mismatch between commonly held beliefs that can be retailored to make food. So to look at you both coming from India, or many of you come from India, the combination of a cereal with legumes is still not obviously rampant in all villages that I have visited and you have visited. So Dr. Ravi's point is that how can we make those common sense links between combining things to make it more effective? And I think it's there somewhere in the maternal wisdom, but how do we systematize it and how do we articulate in a way that we can make it much more accessible to many people around the world or around the regions of India and beyond? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for a very, very good and interesting talk. I just have a question. You make a very compelling argument using technology to improve nutrition in children and generally across the population. I wonder, is there also an argument to say that we have to go back to the more traditional thinking, to our traditional ways of food preparation, the way we fed children and adults, whether we have lost, not only in Asian countries, but in other countries as well, some of that. So rather than just focusing on technology and improving what we have, is to actually go a step back and see what did we do then, and should we reintroduce some of these old, more traditional ways in populations again?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I need to be quite categorical in my interpretation of the term technology. I don't mean technology which is of the kind that's high tech. Let me give you a good example. Many of us, when we make rice gruel, not always, don't roast the rice powder before it's made into a weaning food. Surprise, surprise, to me, roasting of a cereal is technology, because in a sense, it's simplified way of moving the starch molecules, which are easy to swell, into a swelling less property. So I'm using the word technology to simply mean things that we normally don't do in our normally parlance of making weaning foods in a way that actually, so for example, the colleagues talked about from India. In many parts of India, you don't make weaning foods a priori without roasting. Some regions they do. So the question is, how can you get people that are not roasting the cereals to roast the cereals? Because roasting alters the amylase to amylopectin ratio, forms resistant starch, therefore it alters the swelling property. So that's what I mean. Yeah, yeah. Lady here?
Yes.
So my question is also related to or a follow-up question on that. Knowing that it's so important to enrich the weaning foods, and especially locally, where there are traditions, the way of cooking, because I agree, it should be a really baseline technology. How do you think we can support local communities on also looking at their cooking skills, traditional way of cooking, and changing that in a way that they understand and they will do it? Because if they have done it and they learn how to cook, and they may do it in a wrong way, by adding too much water or any other means, it's really difficult to change this behavior and make it effectively.
Yeah, I think you make a very eloquent point. I have no simple answer, to be honest with you, but I can give some stabs of suggestions. And I think the first point was made by my colleague here. How do we disseminate knowledge that's already known in one part of the country to another? And I think you'll be surprised that percolation of knowledge is a very, very slow process. I mean, people didn't believe that people believed the earth was flat for centuries. So the point is that knowledge does not translate into actionable commodities. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that we need to be collectively starting that journey. Because if we don't, as a group here, who got the most brightest intellect in trying to address this problem, then I think there is a sort of shortfall of intellectual permeation. I also think that there is a profound need for much more interaction between what you might call north-north, north-south, south-south, and I think that's becoming much less compared to what I was when I was a student. And when I was a student, there was much more traffic between northern hemisphere people to southern hemisphere, southern to southern, and I think we need to encourage that, because many, many agencies and governments around the world are cutting down international aid. And I think that's some of the things that we need to be also keep a watchful eye on, because the future is about those directional discourses. Ajidza.
You allow me?
Yeah, bright and
Yeah.
clear.
Thank you very much, Prof. Henry. What you presented is really occur in Indonesia. For instance, for the low-income mother, usually use rice porridge, rice porridge, or more water without adding anything except salt, or maybe a little bit egg, only a very small size of cut of egg. The second thing that I would like to answer is about, the first is just a comment. The second thing is about is the fatty acid composition or the quality is matter, instead of only about to have the adequate energy from a combination of fat, protein, and carbohydrate. Thank you very much.
No, so excellent question. And I think if I had another hour, I would talk only about lipid profile. Yeah. Because lipid profile is critical, particularly the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. Most of the oils that we consume are not in the right proportion. So I think, brain development that's happening is also. So my primary hypothesis was much of the challenges of human growth in children is predicated on the eating of very low energy dense diet. The easiest way to alter that is to add oil, because it does two things. One is reduces viscosity, like magic, and you know that. And secondly, it increases the energy density. So, but quantity is not the same as quality. And I think quality becomes a secondary issue, because if you can't even get the child to survive, there's little point talking esoterically about the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio.
Melda?
So thank you, Dr. Jaya, for that very comprehensive lecture. We know very well that to solve the problem, we need an intervention mix. And we know that very well. However, you have posted challenges that there should be a convergence of efforts among all these key stakeholders. For me, I think one of the key stakeholder also is actually the industries, the food industries. So what's your comment on how can we actually mobilize or entice these industries to make their products more nutritious and more affordable because they have that kind of media reach for the poor segments of the population?
Yeah, so very good question. So the question was, how can industry play a more critical role, yeah? So I think you make a very vital point, but also be mindful that we have at the current time a very uneasy discourse about what role can small, medium, large industries play, and this whole question about processed foods being not the sort of the best thing. I have a different view. I personally think that industry has a role to play at whatever level, and the question is that how do we get that dyad between what I would call private-public partnership much more systematized and not be bogged down by sort of rhetorical discussions that actually makes no sense, more heat than light.
I would like to just read this question from Ainik of Indonesia. Can raw foods such as soy be used in preparing RUTF instead of peanuts?
Yeah. So the question, excuse me, the question was, can raw soya, yeah? So the short, excuse me, bit excited. The short answer is no, for three reasons. Raw soya contains a whole series of toxins, trypsin inhibitors, hemagglutinins, many saponins. If you cook it, then that's perfectly adequate. Actually, the magic that I would suggest is to use your soya to make tempeh, and then from tempeh you can make RUTF. Not only will it be fantastic, it tastes good, and the baby may not come off your hands.
Other questions? Yes, Dr. Makalintal?
My question is, here in the Philippines, there are still places wherein commercialism, industrialism has not been reached, and wherein rice is also a shortage in these areas. What other sources, aside from root crops, for example, that can we advise our patients? And what other, in relation to the other question about the peanuts, the raw peanuts, can we incorporate that, for example, to this root crops as a source of energy?
Okay, so the second question was, can raw peanuts be used as a source of energy? So the short answer is that I think I would personally not advise you to use raw peanuts for two reasons. One is microbial contamination. Secondly, raw peanuts have a different rate of hydrolysis compared to roasted or even boiled. So try and use boiled or roasted peanuts for your subvention. So to answer the question, what are the other root crops or cereals that are in accession to making complementary foods? There are a few minor crops, maybe not so much in Philippines, but in Asia, they're no more minor, which are sorghum, millet, now more recently in Southern America, quinoa. And so there are many alternatives. But I think the challenge that we have is that rice is a part of our staple for millennia. And it's quite difficult. I still tend to eat rice, although I've lived in Europe most of my life, because I have kind of an affinity toward rice since my childhood. So if my wife or my mom gives me something else, I'm not in a very good mood. So the point is that rice has got a symbolic value that's very sacrosanct to our part of the world. And therefore, to substitute that may not be as easy as what I and you think.
Are there other questions?
Oh, that's one.
Yes.
Professor, thank you for your wonderful lecture. I was just wondering though that at the start of the lecture you mentioned something about the impact of maternal health and its effect on the health of the infant at that. So do you think that giving low index, glycemic index food for mothers though would help regarding its neonatal outcome?
Very good. So gestational diabetes in Asia is uniquely high. 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 women in this region get GDM. And paradoxically, there have been no systematic intervention trials on feeding a low GI diet during pregnancy to alter the process of GDM. So the answer is that all evidence suggests, certainly not in GDM because we don't have the data, that feeding people a low GI diet reduces your risk of transforming from a pre-diabetic to diabetic. So because glucose excursion is attenuated. But the real challenge that many of the foods that we all consume are by default high GI. Potato, high. White bread, high. Rice, high. Corn, high. So the trick is to combine it with something so that the protein component or the lipid content automatically reduce the glycemic response by forming a complex between the starch molecule and the lipid or the protein-protein interaction. So I think if you think about this around the world, we don't tend to eat rice alone, I mean extreme poverty or whatever, but we always have some vegetable or a piece of fish or a piece of tofu or some tempeh, and the magic is that that combination that was based on culinary desire, because it tastes better, surprise, surprise, also lowers glycemia.
And if I may add, glycemic index is not just influenced by one type of food. It's actually the composition of the diet that does affect the glycemic index. So it's the cereal, the protein, the fiber that you take in. Okay, are there other questions? So with that, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Henry for such a comprehensive report.